I was 28 when I took the trip that should have been nothing more than a quiet weekend alone in the woods. It was mid-September, the time of year when the leaves were just starting to turn, but the air still held the last warmth of summer. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A break from work, from people, from everything. The plan was simple. 2 nights in an old hunting cabin that belonged to a friend of my uncle. It sat deep in the valley, miles from the nearest paved road. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove and a hand pump for water. I wasn't worried about the isolation. I'd spent plenty of time alone in the woods before. I had my truck, a .357 revolver for bears, and enough supplies to last me a week if I had to. The drive out took longer than expected. The gravel road turned into little more than a set of tire ruts winding through dense timber. I had to take it slow, weaving around fallen branches and deep potholes. It was nearly dusk by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. The place was smaller than I'd imagined, barely more than a shack with a rusted metal roof and weathered wood siding. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, taking in the quiet. No sounds of traffic, no distant hum of civilization. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird. Perfect. The inside of the cabin was simple. A cot against one wall, a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a set of shelves with a few old canned goods left behind by previous visitors. There was no sign of rodents, which was a relief. I set down my gear and got to work starting a fire in the stove. By the time I had everything settled, water pumped, food unpacked, firewood stacked by the door, it was dark. I ate a quick dinner of canned chili, read by lantern light for a while, and finally turned in for the night. ##### the first night. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. Took me a second to realize what had startled me. The sound of something moving outside. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind, these were deliberate, measured steps. Something moving just beyond the walls of the cabin. I reached for my revolver and sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow, circling the cabin. Then they stopped. Silence. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or maybe a black bear passing through. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. #### the second day. Morning brought no answers. I stepped outside, gun in hand, and checked around the cabin. There were no obvious tracks, just the usual signs of small animals in the dirt. I shook off the unease, made coffee on the stove, and spent most of the day hiking the surrounding area. The valley was beautiful, untouched wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. A few times, though, I got the feeling I was being watched. I'd stop, look around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound beyond the wind and birds. By the time I made it back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the feeling had mostly passed. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion. That night, I made sure the revolver was loaded and within reach before going to sleep. #### the second night. It happened again. I woke up to the sound of movement outside. This time, the footsteps were heavier, slower. I sat up, gripping the gun. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Then I heard it, something brushing against the wood just outside. Not an animal. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then came another sound. The doorknob rattled. I was on my feet in an instant, heart hammering. I aimed the revolver at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. The knob twisted once, then again, and then silence. I stood there for what felt like an hour, listening, waiting. Eventually, I forced myself to move toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gun in hand, staring at the door. #### the final day. The first light, I packed my gear. I didn't care if I was supposed to stay another night. I was leaving. Stepping outside, I checked the ground around the cabin. This time, there were tracks. Not boot prints, bare feet. Large, human. The tracks circled the cabin, stopping right at the door. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear into the truck, started the engine, and backed out onto the trail as fast as I could without wrecking. The whole drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me, just trees and empty road. By the time I reached the main highway, I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I never went back to that valley, and I never asked my uncle who exactly had been out there before me. I was 32 the first time I saw the cabin. It was deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, tucked so far off any marked trail that even the most seasoned outdoorsman would have walked right past without ever knowing it was there. I found it by accident. It was early October, the kind of crisp autumn where the cold hadn't fully set in, but you could feel it creeping closer with every breath. I had taken a week off from work, needing to get away from everything, clear my head, and just be alone for a while. I'd always been that way. Solitude was something I craved, something I needed from time to time. So I packed my gear, drove 6 hours north, and planned a long solo trek through the Superior National Forest. The first few days were uneventful. The trails were quiet, the air was cool, and the leaves were a fiery mix of reds and oranges, the kind of landscape you only get for a short window each year. I kept to myself, moving deeper into the forest, making camp in different spots each night, always careful to leave no trace behind. I had no cell service, but that was part of the appeal. On the fourth day, I veered off course. I wasn't lost. Not yet. But I had definitely wandered farther than I meant to. It started with curiosity. I noticed an old, overgrown path branching off the main trail, barely visible beneath years of fallen leaves and tangled roots. Something about it caught my eye. Maybe it was the way the trees arched over it, creating a tunnel-like effect, or maybe it was just the simple fact that I had never seen it on any maps. Either way, I took it. First, it was nothing special. Just more forest, thicker than before, the undergrowth denser. But then, about an hour in, I saw it. The cabin. It was small, maybe a single room, with a sagging roof and walls that had gone gray with age. The windows were either missing or boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar. The place looked long abandoned, but something about it didn't feel right. There were no signs of rot or decay, no broken glass, no graffiti, nothing that screamed human presence, but nothing that screamed nature taking over either. It was just there, waiting. I hesitated. I've always had a healthy respect for the unknown, and walking into an old, forgotten structure in the middle of the woods wasn't exactly on my to-do list. But curiosity won. I stepped closer. The door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the scent of old wood and damp earth. I took a cautious step in. My boots scuffed against the floor, kicking up a cloud of dust that swirled in the thin light filtering through the gaps in the walls. The room was almost empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, just a few scattered items. A rusted tin can, a broken lantern, the remnants of a fire pit near the center of the floor. But there were footprints. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Someone had been here. I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was something close. I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't just the eerie stillness or the unsettling way the cabin seemed preserved against time. It was a gut feeling, a deep, instinctual warning that told me to leave. But I didn't. Not right away. I moved deeper, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. Against the far wall, I saw something strange. Scratch marks, deep grooves carved into the wood, spaced out unevenly, almost like tally marks. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some old, faded, barely visible. Others fresh. That was enough. I turned on my heel and stepped back toward the door, ready to leave, when something crunched underfoot. I looked down. Bones. Small ones. Animals, maybe. I walked out fast, forcing myself not to run, telling myself it was nothing, just an old hunter's cabin. Someone using it as a temporary shelter. Nothing sinister, nothing weird, just my own paranoia. But then I saw the path. A second trail leading away from the cabin, one I hadn't noticed before. And on that path, there were footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin, but not toward it. I left. I didn't stop walking until I was miles away. I didn't make camp that night, didn't eat, didn't rest. I just walked. My instincts screamed at me to get out, to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. I didn't stop until dawn. The rest of the trip was a blur. I barely remember getting back to my car, barely remember the drive home. But I do remember the feeling, the overwhelming sense that I had stumbled onto something I was never supposed to find, that I had gotten too close to something that was still out there. I never went back, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see it. The cabin, the scratches on the wall, the fresh footprints leading away, and I wonder who made them and where did they go? I was 26 when I agreed to house-sit a remote cabin for a friend's uncle. It was deep in the northern Montana wilderness, about an hour from the nearest town. The place was old but well-kept, sitting near the base of a densely forested ridge with no neighbors in sight. The uncle was heading out of state for a few months, and he needed someone to keep an eye on the property. It seemed like an easy way to get away from the city, clear my head, and enjoy some solitude. Looking back, I should have asked more questions. The drive out was long and uneventful. Once I left the main highway, I had to follow a winding gravel road that stretched for miles through thick pine and fir trees. The deeper I went, the less the road looked like it was used often. When I finally reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. There was no traffic noise, no hum of distant machines, just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch shifting in the breeze. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of thick logs that had darkened with age. A narrow front porch wrapped around one side, and a single set of steps led up to the door. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. The place was stocked with firewood, canned food, and plenty of drinking water. A well out back provided fresh water, and a propane generator powered the lights and appliances. It was simple but comfortable enough. The first few days passed without incident. I settled into a routine, splitting firewood, hiking the trails behind the cabin, reading in the evenings by the fire. The weather was cool but clear, and I enjoyed the silence. There was something peaceful about being so far removed from everything. But on the 5th night, things started to feel different. I had just finished eating and was sitting on the porch when I noticed movement in the trees at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but as I watched, I realized whatever was out there wasn't moving like an animal. It was staying just inside the tree line, pacing slowly. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape shifting between the trunks. After a few minutes, the figure disappeared deeper into the forest. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but something about it unsettled me. The next morning, I found fresh tracks in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were human footprints, but they weren't mine. They were slightly larger than my own boots and looked like they had been made by someone walking barefoot. The ground was cold, too cold for anyone to be walking around without shoes. I followed them for a short distance before they veered off into the underbrush, disappearing into the woods. That night, I made sure to lock the doors and close the curtains before bed. I told myself it was probably just a lost hiker passing through, but something about those prints didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had made them had been watching the cabin. Over the next few nights, I kept hearing strange noises outside. At first, it was just small things, twigs snapping, rustling in the bushes. But by the end of the week, it had escalated. Heavy footsteps on the porch, the sound of something scratching against the wooden walls. I started keeping the rifle from the cabin's gun rack loaded and within arm's reach at all times. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of the back door creaking open. I knew I had locked it. My heart was pounding as I reached for the rifle and slowly sat up in bed. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense. There was silence for a long moment, then the soft creak of a floorboard in the kitchen. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The cabin fell silent again. I sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, gripping the rifle so tightly my hands ached. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, the first light of dawn was spilling through the windows. I checked the back door first. It was closed, but the lock was broken. The footprints in the dirt outside were fresh, barefoot, just like before. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the trees. Whoever had been out there hadn't bothered to take anything. They had just been inside. That was enough for me. I packed my things, loaded up my truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove back down the gravel road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I never went back. I told my friend's uncle that I had left early because of a family emergency. He didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any details. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching me, I didn't want to know. The cabin sat deep in the Montana wilderness, miles away from the nearest paved road. It had been built decades ago, meant to be a hunting retreat, but time had worn it down. The wood was dark, aged, and cracked in places. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were covered with old curtains, stained yellow with time. It was the kind of place people went to disappear, either by choice or not. I had found it listed on a backwoods rental site. I wanted solitude, quiet, a place to be away from everything for a while. I was 32, tired of the constant noise of city life, and looking for something different. I'd spent the last 10 years working in an office, staring at screens, dealing with stress that never seemed to end. This was supposed to be my reset, a couple of weeks in the wilderness, just me, my thoughts, and nature. I had driven up in my old truck, bouncing along miles of unmaintained dirt roads until I reached the place. There was no cell service, no electricity except for a small generator, and no running water other than a pump outside. It was exactly what I had been looking for, but I would learn too late that some places should be left alone. Arrival. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking in the silence. The trees pressed in around the clearing, towering pines with rough bark and heavy branches that blocked out most of the sky. The air smelled of earth, pine needles, and something else. Something faint, something sour. The cabin looked abandoned, even though I knew it wasn't. The listing had said it was maintained. The owner had even messaged me, saying there was plenty of firewood stacked out back and that the generator worked fine. But still, something about it made my skin crawl. I shook it off. I was just being paranoid. I grabbed my bags from the truck and headed inside. Inside the cabin, the inside was simple. A wood stove, a small kitchen, a single bedroom with a worn-out bed. There were deer antlers mounted on the walls, a few old hunting rifles in a locked case, and shelves lined with dusty books. A table with 2 chairs sat near the window. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked. I set my bags down and went to check out the generator. It was behind the cabin, near a rusted-out metal shed. The thing looked ancient, but when I pulled the cord, it roared to life. The cabin lights flickered on inside. Satisfied, I went back in and settled down. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, sat by the wood stove, and read one of the old books from the shelf. It felt good to be away from everything. No traffic, no emails, no people. But then I started noticing things. The signs. It was small at first. A feeling more than anything. The sensation of being watched. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar setting, the way the trees pressed in, the isolation. But then there were the noises. At night, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Animals move erratically, quick bursts of movement, then silence. This was steady, pacing. The second night, I found the front door slightly open when I woke up. I knew I had locked it. The latch wasn't broken, but the door was open just enough to let in the cold air. I started keeping my knife close at night. I set up small traps, sticks balanced against the door, a cup placed on the doorknob, things that would let me know if someone was coming inside. Every morning, I woke up to find them undisturbed, but I knew something was off. The discovery. On the fourth day, I went exploring. I hiked deep into the woods, following a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. About a mile in, I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Clearing, small, hidden, and in the center of it, a hole. It wasn't natural. It had been dug deep and wide, maybe 6 feet across. The dirt was piled around it. Inside, something was buried under a tarp. The smell coming from it was awful, even in the cold air. I didn't want to know what was under it. I turned back, moving fast, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. Someone had been here recently. The dirt was fresh. The hole hadn't been covered yet. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. I locked the doors, loaded the old hunting rifle from the case, and sat near the window watching. That night, I didn't sleep. The final night started around midnight. The sound of footsteps, not just one person, multiple. They didn't try to be quiet. They walked right up to the cabin. I could hear them breathing, shuffling in the dirt outside. Then came the sound of something being dragged. I gripped the rifle tight, my knuckles white. I could see their shadows through the thin curtains. Tall, human, moving slow. They stood outside for what felt like hours. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they left. But not before I heard one final sound. Something heavy being thrown against the cabin door. I waited until morning to open it. It was the tarp. I never should have come here. Escape. I didn't pack. I didn't check the truck. I just grabbed the keys and ran. The engine roared to life, and I tore down that dirt road faster than I ever had before, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I made it back to town in record time. I stopped at a gas station, shaking, my hands still gripping the wheel. I told the clerk I had been camping, made up some excuse about a bear, and drove straight home. I didn't call the owner. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. Whatever was out there, it wasn't my problem anymore. A week later, I checked the listing again. It was gone. Conclusion: I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they were doing. But I know I was never supposed to see that clearing. And I know that whoever left that tarp on my doorstep wanted me to understand something. That cabin wasn't meant for visitors. I had never been a fan of cabins. Maybe it was the isolation, the way the walls seemed to close in on you at night, or the way the woods always felt too quiet, like they were listening. But that didn't stop me from saying yes when my cousin, Mark, invited me on a weekend trip to a cabin he had rented in northern Minnesota. I had been working long hours and a break sounded nice. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, a simple wooden structure that had probably been built decades ago. It sat near a small, dark lake, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. The drive up was uneventful, just endless stretches of trees and narrow dirt roads that seemed to go on forever. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Mark was already there, his truck parked haphazardly near the front steps. He had left a note on the door saying he had gone down to the lake to fish and would be back later. I unlocked the door with the key he had left and stepped inside. The cabin was small but functional. A single main room with a kitchen, a wood stove, and a couple of chairs, along with a short hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and a propane stove. It smelled of old wood and damp air, like it hadn't been used in a long time. A single window faced the lake, giving a view of the still water beyond. I set my bags down in one of the bedrooms and sat on the couch, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain to pick up any noise at all. No birds, no wind, just an empty, hollow silence. As the sky darkened, I lit a lantern and placed it on the table. Mark still hadn't come back. I wasn't worried at first. He liked to fish until the last bit of light faded. But as the hours passed, a strange feeling started to settle in my chest. Something felt off. It wasn't just that he was late, it was the fact that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. I stepped outside and called his name, my voice carrying into the night. No answer. I walked down the narrow trail toward the lake, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The water was still smooth like glass. His tackle box was sitting on the shore, his fishing pole propped up nearby. But he wasn't there. A chill ran through me. It wasn't like Mark to just leave without saying anything. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam dancing over the trees and water. Then I saw them. Footprints leading away from the shore, disappearing into the woods. I followed them, my boots crunching against the underbrush. The prints were deep, like he had been moving fast. As I moved further into the forest, the air grew colder. The trees pressed in closer, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out what little moonlight there was. Then I saw it, a piece of fabric caught on a low branch. It was from Mark's jacket. My stomach twisted. I called his name again, louder this time. Nothing, just the oppressive silence of the woods. Something wasn't right. My gut told me to turn back, but I couldn't just leave him out there. I pushed forward, scanning the ground for more signs of him. The footprints became erratic, zigzagging as if he had been running from something. My breathing grew heavy. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Another set of footprints. These weren't marks. They were larger, deeper, like whoever made them was heavier. And they followed his tracks step for step. I stood frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The realization hit me all at once. Someone had been following him. The footprints continued deeper into the woods, but I couldn't go any further. I had no weapon, no idea what I was walking into. My only choice was to get back to the cabin and call for help. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees blurred around me, my footsteps loud against the silence. When I reached the clearing, the cabin's lantern was still burning, casting flickering shadows against the walls. But something was wrong. The door was open. I knew I had closed it when I left. My hands shook as I stepped inside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was just as I had left it, except for one thing. The lantern had been moved. It was sitting on the floor now, closer to the door. Like someone had been waiting for me. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone. The air in the cabin felt wrong, heavy with something unseen. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to move, searching the room. No one. The bedrooms were empty. But then I saw something that made my skin crawl. Boot prints. Fresh, muddy prints leading from the door to the center of the room. And then they stopped. Whoever had been inside had left. Or worse, they were still here, hiding. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I didn't slow down. The police found Mark 2 days later, miles from the cabin. He was alive but shaken, his clothes torn, his face gaunt. He couldn't remember much, just running, the feeling of being chased. He had survived by hiding in the underbrush, waiting until dawn to move. They never found whoever had been following him. I haven't been back to the woods since. I was 31 when I found the cabin. It was early October, the days just beginning to shorten, and I had taken a week off from work to escape into the mountains. I'd done solo trips before, always preferring the quiet of being alone in the woods. I planned a 5-day trek along a section of remote forestland in Montana, moving between established but rarely used campsites. I carried a lightweight tent, enough food to last, and a GPS for safety. It was a trip like many I'd done before, until I stumbled upon the cabin. I hadn't planned to go off the trail that day. I was hiking along a ridge, following a poorly marked footpath that cut through thick lodgepole pines and clusters of underbrush. The trail was barely visible in places, just a slight depression in the forest floor, but my GPS assured me I was on course. I was about 6 miles from where I planned to set up camp when I noticed something odd, something man-made through the trees. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the way old tree stumps or fallen logs sometimes looked like structures from a distance. But as I moved closer, I could see straight lines, angles that didn't belong in nature. I wasn't expecting to see any kind of structure out here. The maps I'd studied showed no signs of old ranger cabins or fire lookout stations in the area. I veered off the trail, curiosity getting the better of me, pushing through underbrush until I got a clear view. It was a cabin, a small, weathered structure sitting alone in the woods. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, the logs dark with age, but the structure itself was intact. No broken windows, no sign of collapse, no overgrowth swallowing it. Just there, standing quietly like it had been forgotten. Something about it unsettled me. I stood there for a long minute scanning the area. There was no old road leading to it, no signs of a footpath. If someone had built it, they must have done it a long time ago. I took a step closer. The ground in front of the cabin was packed down, not by recent foot traffic but by years of exposure. There were no fresh footprints, no discarded cans or bottles, no sign of human presence in a long time. I should have walked away. I should have left it alone. But I wanted to look inside. I stepped onto the porch carefully, testing the wood beneath my boots. Creaked but held my weight. The door was closed, the handle rusted, but not locked. I hesitated, a prickling sensation running up the back of my neck. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep unease, like I was about to do something I shouldn't. I twisted the handle and pushed. The door stuck at first, then gave way with a groan of protesting wood. Inside, it was dark. I let my eyes adjust, stepping cautiously over the threshold. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and old wood. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dirt and leaves that must have blown in over the years. A single wooden table stood in the center of the room, one chair tucked beneath it. Against the back wall, a rusted wood stove sat cold and lifeless. There was a bed frame in the corner, no mattress, just a rusted skeleton of metal springs. But what unsettled me most was what was on the table. A plate, a fork, a knife, not old and rotting, not covered in dust like everything else. Just sitting there, clean like someone had set it out for a meal. I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. My first thought was that maybe some other hiker had come through recently, but that didn't explain why the rest of the cabin was coated in dust and grime while that table setting wasn't. I backed away, my heartbeat in my throat. I turned toward the door, and that's when I saw the footprints. Not mine, not old faded prints from decades past. Fresh ones, leading from the doorway to the table and then stopping. No exit tracks, no prints leading back outside. Just a set of footprints that ended in the middle of the room, like whoever made them had simply vanished. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. I stepped backward, out the door, and onto the porch, my hands shaking. I scanned the trees, listening. The forest was silent, not even the usual rustling of wind through the branches. I didn't linger. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to break into a run, not to give in to the primal fear crawling through me. I didn't stop until I was back on the trail, heart hammering against my ribs. I looked back once through the trees. The cabin was still there, unchanged, but now it felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness inside. I hiked faster than I ever had before, pushing forward until I reached my planned campsite just before sunset. I barely slept that night. Every snap of a branch, every distant rustling made my pulse jump. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was cutting my trip short. I packed up and started the long trek back to my car. I never told anyone about the cabin. I never reported it, never looked for it on a map. I don't even know if I could find it again if I tried. Maybe that's for the best, because sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still see those footprints in my mind, ending in the middle of the room, leading nowhere. I was 28 when I decided to take a week off work and head out to the mountains of northern Idaho. I had grown up in Montana, spent my childhood running through the woods, fishing in cold rivers, and pitching tents in the middle of nowhere. But life had pulled me away from that. Jobs, responsibilities, city living. I missed the quiet, the rawness of being out there with nothing but the trees and the sky. So, I booked a remote cabin, about 12 miles off the nearest paved road, and packed up my truck with food, water, a rifle, and all the gear I thought I might need. The cabin wasn't anything special. One room, a wood stove, a cot, and a small kitchen area with a propane stove. It sat near the edge of a thick pine forest, with a small clearing out front where an old fire ring had been built. There was no electricity, no running water. Just an outhouse about 30 yards into the woods and a well with a hand pump near the front steps. The kind of place where you're completely alone, which was exactly what I wanted. I got there in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the ridgeline. The drive up had been rough, miles of washed-out dirt roads, potholes deep enough to swallow a tire, and a few switchbacks that made me nervous even with four-wheel drive. The cabin looked untouched, just as the owner had described it. A few stacks of firewood sat under the awning, untouched snow around them suggesting no one had been up here in weeks. The air was crisp, pine-scented, and dead silent. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire outside, cooked some canned chili, and sat under the stars for a while before turning in. The cot was stiff, the blankets smelled like dust, but I was tired enough that it didn't matter. I slept soundly until dawn. The second day, I explored the surrounding woods, following an old game trail that led down toward a narrow creek about a mile away. I saw plenty of animal tracks, deer, elk, even a few coyote prints, but nothing unusual. It felt good to be back in the wilderness, away from everything. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, getting a good pile stacked by the cabin for the colder nights ahead. That night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of snow. I stayed still, listening. The cabin had no windows, just a single door with a latch. I hadn't locked it. It wasn't the kind of place where you expected to need a lock. The sound moved around the cabin, soft but steady, circling. I reached for my rifle, my heart pounding. I sat in the dark for what felt like an hour, barely breathing, gripping the rifle, waiting for something, anything to happen. Eventually, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to look for tracks. The snow was firm, frozen overnight, but I could see them. Footprints. Bare human footprints. They started from the tree line, circled the cabin twice, and then disappeared back into the woods. The hair on my neck stood up. It was below freezing at night. There was no way someone was walking around out here barefoot unless they were in serious trouble or seriously dangerous. I thought about leaving right then, but it was broad daylight and I figured whoever it was had moved on. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost or some hermit living out in the woods had wandered by. It was unsettling, but I told myself I'd be fine. I spent the day hunting, bringing down a rabbit with my .22, trying to shake the unease in my gut. That night, I locked the door, latched it tight, kept my rifle within arm's reach, and still just past midnight I woke up again. The sound was back. Slow, crunching steps in the snow. I held my breath, listening. The steps came right up to the door and stopped. I gripped the rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. Silence stretched out for what felt like forever. And then, the door handle rattled. I nearly pulled the trigger right then, but I held back, forcing myself to stay calm. The latch held. Whoever was out there, they didn't try to break in. Just tested the handle, then stood there. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, close. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I threw everything back into my truck and got out of there. The drive back down the mountain was nerve-wracking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But I made it down to the main road without incident, then drove straight to the nearest town. I told the local sheriff what had happened. He listened, nodded, then told me something that made my blood run cold. 2 years earlier, a man had gone missing up in those woods. He had been living off-grid in a cabin not too different from the one I'd rented. When search and rescue found the place, they discovered signs that someone else had been there. Someone who had broken in, taken food, and left behind bare footprints in the snow. They never found the missing man, just his empty cabin, and tracks leading away into the trees. I was looking for somewhere quiet, somewhere I could be alone for a while. That was the whole point of the trip. Getting away from the constant noise of the city, the emails, the phone calls, the obligations. I wanted to go somewhere remote, just me and the woods. I had found the cabin through a rental website. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room structure deep in the northern Minnesota wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. The owner, some older guy named Don, had listed it as off-grid, perfect for the solo adventurer. It had no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. Just a wood stove, a small cot, and a hand pump well outside. Sounded perfect. The drive was long, nearly 5 hours from where I lived. Most of it spent on winding back roads that turned into dirt trails. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, the sky tinged with orange. I parked my truck on the small gravel clearing in front and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, crisp and clean compared to the city's stale exhaust. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, a weathered wooden structure with a slanted tin roof. The front door had a simple latch, no lock, and the single window had wooden shutters that could be closed from the inside. I grabbed my bag from the truck, stepped inside, and looked around. It was basic, just as described. A cot in the corner, a wood stove with a pile of split logs beside it, a rickety wooden table with a single chair, and some shelves nailed to the walls. I set my gear down and went outside to check out the area before it got dark. The land behind the cabin sloped downward into thick forest, with a narrow, overgrown trail leading deeper in. I followed it for a few minutes, pushing through tall grass and underbrush until I came to a small creek. The water was clear and slow-moving, and I crouched down to splash some on my face. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were in the damp soil near the water's edge, boot prints, deep and well-defined. But they weren't mine. They were older, slightly washed out by the rain, but still distinct. I frowned. The listing had mentioned that the land belonged to the cabin's owner and that it was private property. No hiking trails, no other cabins nearby. So who had been out here? I shook it off. Could have been Don, checking on the place, or maybe a hunter passing through. It didn't matter. I was here for solitude, and I wasn't about to let a few old footprints ruin that. I hiked back to the cabin as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The air was already getting colder, and I started a fire in the wood stove before eating a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. As I sat at the small table, listening to the fire crackle, I felt it again, that strange, creeping awareness that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. The city was loud even at night, a constant hum of cars and distant sirens. Out here, the silence pressed in from all sides. That first night, I barely slept. I woke up multiple times, hearing noises outside. Soft crunching, like something moving in the leaves. A faint tapping sound against the wooden walls. Every time I sat up, heart pounding, the noise would stop. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. The next morning, I went outside and did a slow circle around the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no signs of animals rummaging around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching. I spent the day hiking, trying to put it out of my mind. I followed the creek downstream for a while, then looped back through the woods, keeping an eye out for any signs of other people. But I didn't see anything. No footprints, no campsites, no trash. That night, the noises came again, closer this time. I was lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Not an animal, not the skittering of a raccoon or the heavy shuffle of a deer. These were human footsteps, heavy and steady. I held my breath. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I sat up as quietly as I could, my heart hammering. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence. Then a slow, deliberate tap against the wood. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack and stood up, every muscle in my body tense. I waited, listening. Nothing. I moved to the window, careful not to make noise, and peeked through a gap in the shutters. The night was dark. The forest nothing but a wall of blackness beyond the small clearing. But I saw something. A shape just at the tree line. Tall, unmoving. Watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the figure was gone. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I wasn't alone out here. I packed up my things, threw my bag in the truck, and didn't look back as I drove away. I never reported it. Never contacted Don to ask if he had been out there. I didn't want to know the answer. I never went back. I had always wanted to spend time alone in the woods. Not for anything spiritual or deep, just to get away. My job was draining, my apartment felt like a box, and every day was a loop of the same thing. The idea of isolation felt like the reset I needed. I found a small cabin online. It was in the middle of nowhere, cheap, and had everything I needed. No internet, no neighbors, just quiet. That's what I wanted. I packed light food, clothes, a flashlight, and a few books. My phone would be useless, but I brought it anyway, just in case. The drive took me deep into the woods. The roads were narrow and winding, barely more than dirt paths in some places. I didn't pass a single car for miles. That was fine. That was the point. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just a simple wooden structure with a tiny front porch. There was a small shed behind it, but I didn't plan on using it. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, there was a single bed, a small table, and an old wood stove. A lantern sat on the table. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. It was exactly what I wanted. I settled in quickly. I stacked my food in the corner, checked the stove, and made sure the door locked properly. I didn't expect anyone to come this far, but it was still good to be sure. The first night was peaceful. I read by lantern light, listened to the sounds of the woods, and eventually fell asleep. The second night, I started noticing things. Small things. The first was the feeling that someone had been inside the cabin while I was out collecting firewood. My bag was moved slightly, and my flashlight wasn't where I left it. It wasn't drastic, but I knew I didn't do it. I told myself I was imagining things. The next night, it got worse. I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't an animal, it was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved around the cabin, stopping at the front door. I sat up, heart pounding. The lantern was still on, casting shadows across the wooden walls. I waited. The footsteps moved again, circling the cabin. Then they stopped, right outside my window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The window was small, covered by a thin curtain. I couldn't see out, but I knew someone was there, standing, watching. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked outside. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, bare feet. I wanted to leave, but I told myself it was just some local messing around. Maybe a hiker who got lost. Maybe a drunk. I told myself anything that made sense. The next night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and kept my flashlight close. The air inside felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I heard the noise again, a soft tapping. Not at the door, not at the window, on the walls. A slow, deliberate tapping, moving, circling. I gripped my flashlight, every muscle tense. The tapping stopped, then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath. The bolt held, then silence. I waited. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no sounds. I told myself they were gone, but I didn't sleep. When the sun came up, I made my decision. I packed my things, threw everything in my car, and left. I didn't check the shed. I didn't look back. I just drove. Hours later, when I finally got service, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was gone. The site had no record of it. No owner, no history, like it was never there. I don't know who was outside my cabin those nights. I don't want to know. I haven't been back. I never will. I never liked being out in the woods alone. Something about the emptiness of it all always felt wrong to me. Like I wasn't really alone even when I knew I was. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe it was something deeper. Something instinctual, buried in my bones, warning me that solitude out here wasn't natural. But when my old college buddy, Mark, offered me his family's hunting cabin for a weekend getaway, I took it. He swore it was a peaceful spot, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, perfect for unwinding. The drive up was long and tiring. The roads got rougher the deeper I went, turning from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. My truck kicked up dust as I wound through dense forest, the trees crowding the road like they were trying to swallow it. My GPS lost signal an hour back, so I had to rely on the written directions Mark had given me. He said the cabin was isolated, and he wasn't kidding. I hadn't seen another car or house in miles. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set. It was a small, weathered structure, tucked between towering pines. A simple wooden porch wrapped around the front, and a single window faced the narrow clearing. Mark had said there was a small lake nearby, but I couldn't see it from where I stood. I killed the engine and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. It should have been relaxing, but something about the silence put me on edge. I grabbed my bag from the truck and made my way inside. The door creaked open, revealing a simple interior. One main room with a couch, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. A single bedroom and a bathroom were tucked in the back. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional. I flicked on the lights. They buzzed to life, dim and yellow, barely pushing back the growing darkness outside. Mark had said there was a generator in the shed out back if the power went out. I set my bag down and checked the fridge. A few bottles of water, some canned food. Enough to last the weekend. I had brought my own cooler with some meat and beer, so I wasn't worried. I locked the door, sat on the couch, and let out a deep breath. The silence pressed in. No distant hum of cars, no voices, no music. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, cooked some steak on the portable grill, and drank a couple of beers on the porch. The sky was clear, the stars bright and scattered. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see something move. But there was nothing, just darkness. I turned in early, but sleep didn't come easy. The bed was stiff and the quiet was too much. I was used to the hum of city life, the distant sounds of people, traffic, something. Here there was nothing, just the occasional rustling of leaves outside, the creak of the old cabin. I drifted in and out, waking up several times, convinced I had heard something just outside the window. Each time I lay still, heart pounding, listening, but there was only silence. The next morning I decided to check out the lake. Mark had mentioned it was a short walk from the cabin, down a narrow trail. The path was overgrown, barely visible, but I found it. The air was cooler in the shade of the trees, damp and thick. Birds called out in the distance, the first real sounds of life I had heard since arriving. The lake was small, still, and dark, the kind of water that looked deep even at the edges. No ripples, no fish breaking the surface, just silent, waiting water. There was a small dock, old and weathered, stretching out a few feet. I walked to the edge and looked down. My reflection stared back at me, distorted. Something about the water made me uneasy, like it was too still. I shook the feeling off and turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed it. The trail I had taken down was gone. I spun in a slow circle, my chest tightening. I had followed the same path I had come down, but now it was nothing but unbroken forest. No clear way back. My stomach nodded. I wasn't far from the cabin, maybe a few minutes' walk, but the trees all looked the same. I swallowed hard and picked a direction. After 10 minutes, I realized I was wrong. The trees pressed in closer, the air feeling thicker. My breathing grew shallow. I turned around and tried retracing my steps, but everything looked unfamiliar. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be. I forced myself to stay calm. The lake was behind me. If I just kept moving in one direction, I'd have to hit something familiar eventually. I walked faster, then stopped. Something was ahead, barely visible through the trees. A cabin. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. As I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't my cabin. This one was older, smaller. The wood was gray with age, the windows dark. There was no sign of recent life, no footprints, no path leading to the door. It looked abandoned. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I didn't know where back was anymore. I hesitated, then stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under my weight. I knocked once. The sound was swallowed by the forest. I reached for the handle and pushed. The door swung open with a whisper, revealing darkness. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something rotten. I stepped inside. Dust coated the floor, untouched for years. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, facing the doorway. The fireplace was filled with ashes long since cold. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. My footprints, not leading in, leading out. The blood drained from my face. I hadn't been here before. I hadn't stepped inside this cabin. But the prints were mine, the same boots I was wearing. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest outside suddenly felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I ran. Branches whipped against my face, the undergrowth snagging my legs. I didn't care. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to give out. And then suddenly I was back. The clearing opened up in front of me, and there was my truck, my cabin. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I gunned it down the dirt road, not looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on paved roads, that I let out a breath. My hands were shaking. My mind raced. I didn't understand what had happened, and I didn't want to. I never told Mark. Never mentioned the cabin, the footprints, the feeling that something had been waiting for me out there. I didn't want to know if he had heard stories before. I just knew one thing for certain. I would never go back. I don't know why I agreed to stay there. Maybe it was the idea of getting away from everything, the noise, the people, the constant pressure of work. Maybe I just wanted some time alone. I found the cabin online, some old listing buried in a forum for people looking to disconnect. No reviews, no ratings, just a few grainy pictures of a small wooden structure buried deep in the trees. The guy renting it out responded fast. He didn't ask too many questions, just sent me the coordinates, said there was a well out back for water, and told me to bring enough food because the nearest store was almost an hour away. I packed up my truck and headed out early in the morning. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt. Trees crowded in on both sides, thick and tall, swallowing the sunlight. My GPS cut out miles before I reached the spot, but the instructions were clear enough. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked just like it did in the pictures, small, rough, weathered. It sat in a small clearing, barely big enough for my truck to park without hitting a tree. The front door had a padlock on it, just like the owner had said. The key was hidden under a loose board on the porch. Inside, it was just one big open room. A small kitchen space to the left with an old gas stove and a sink that didn't work. A single cot pushed against the far wall with a thin mattress. An old wooden table with one chair in the middle of the room, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The air smelled like dust and damp wood. I dropped my bag near the cot and went outside to check out the well. It was old, made of crumbling stone, and had a rusty bucket tied to a frayed rope. I turned the crank and pulled up some water. It smelled fine, but I still boiled a pot just in case. The first night was quiet, too quiet. Back home, I was used to the hum of the city, cars passing, distant sirens, people talking. Out here, the silence was thick. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves or the creak of wood as the cabin settled. I sat by the fireplace, eating a can of soup straight from the pot. My phone was useless now, no service, no Wi-Fi, just a black screen with a no-signal icon. I read a book by lantern light until my eyes got heavy, then stretched out on the cot. I woke up to a sound outside, a steady, rhythmic thumping. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then it came again, a solid, heavy thud against the ground. I sat up, heart hammering. My first thought was an animal, a bear maybe, or a deer moving around. But this sound wasn't movement. It was deliberate. I grabbed the lantern and stepped to the window, peering out into the dark. Nothing, just trees, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight. Then the sound came again, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unlatched the door, pushing it open just enough to look out. The clearing was empty. No footprints in the dirt, no broken branches. I shined the light toward the trees, but they stood still, unmoving. I waited, breath held, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I tried to shake it off. Maybe something had fallen from a tree, or an animal had been moving around in a way that just sounded strange. I spent the day chopping wood, walking the edge of the clearing, trying to get a feel for the area. I found a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't go far. I wasn't about to get lost out here. That night, the sound came again, a steady, deliberate thud, closer than before. I gripped my flashlight, debating whether to go outside or stay put. Something about the sound felt wrong. Too steady, too deliberate. Not like something falling, not like an animal moving. It sounded like footsteps, but heavier, like something being dragged. I sat there, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The sound stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Then, a new sound, a soft, slow creak. The sound of the porch step bending under weight. My breath caught in my throat. I turned off the flashlight, holding perfectly still. The creak came again. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the night stretched on, and the sounds didn't return. The next morning, I stepped outside, gripping the hatchet I had used for chopping wood. The dirt in front of the porch was undisturbed. No footprints, nothing. I checked around the cabin, looking for anything. Drag marks, signs of an animal, anything. Nothing. The woods stood still, silent. I had never felt so alone in my life. I wanted to leave, but I had paid for the week, and some stubborn part of me didn't want to run from something I couldn't even explain. I told myself it had to be the old wood shifting, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet. That night, I barricaded the door with the table. The sound came again, a heavy thud, closer, then the creak of the porch, then slow, dragging breaths just outside the door. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The lantern flickered. The air felt thick, heavy. The breathing continued, slow and deep, just on the other side of the wall. Then it stopped. I sat there, gripping the hatchet, heart pounding so hard I thought it might shake the walls. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. When I woke up, the sun was peeking through the trees. The table was still in place. The door was still locked, but something had changed. The air smelled different, like rot. I packed my things in under 5 minutes, threw everything into my truck and didn't look back. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I saw it in the rearview mirror. The cabin, standing silent in the morning light, and just beyond it, in the trees, something dark, something watching. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway. I never contacted the guy who rented the place, never told anyone what happened. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. I had been planning the trip for months. A week alone in the woods, tucked away in an old hunting cabin my uncle had built decades ago. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small table, but it would be enough. I wanted solitude, a break from the constant hum of everyday life. The cabin was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. I had to drive my truck as far as the logging road would allow, then hike another 3 miles with my pack slung over my shoulders. It wasn't my first time out there. I'd spent weekends there with my dad when I was a kid, back when he used it for deer hunting, but it had been years since I'd last made the trip. When I arrived, everything was as I remembered. The cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by dense pines. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and dust swirled in the dim light filtering through the single window. The cot was still against the far wall, the wood stove in its place beside it, and the old table sat in the center of the room with a few rusty cans and a lantern on top. It smelled of old wood and damp earth. I spent the first few hours settling in, sweeping the floor, checking for any leaks in the roof, and gathering firewood. By the time the sun started dipping below the trees, I had a fire going in the stove and my sleeping bag laid out on the cot. It was colder than I expected for early October, but the stove did its job, filling the small cabin with warmth. I cooked a can of beans on the stove, ate in silence, then lay back and listened to the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, made coffee on my propane burner, and spent most of the day exploring. I hiked down to a nearby creek, checked an old deer blind my dad had built years ago, and took my time enjoying the quiet. The woods were empty, no signs of hunters, no distant sounds of civilization, just me and the trees. It was the second night that things started feeling off. I was sitting by the stove, reading by lantern light, when I heard something outside. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest, wind through the branches, an owl calling in the distance. This was different, heavy, a distinct crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I sat still, listening. The footsteps came again, slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the cabin. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the window. The glass reflected back at me, showing only the dim interior of the cabin. I waited, heart pounding, but the sound didn't come again. Just the wind, just the trees. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, a black bear passing through. But I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between the sound of 4 legs and 2. I barely slept that night. Every little noise had me wide-eyed in the dark, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Morning brought a sense of relief. I stepped outside, walking the perimeter of the clearing. I saw no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone, or anything, had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I considered packing up and heading out, but the thought of cutting my trip short over what was probably my own paranoia felt ridiculous. I told myself I was being stupid. The woods could play tricks on you when you were alone. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed deeper. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, gathering firewood and keeping busy. The unease never really left me, though. I caught myself glancing toward the trees more often than I'd like to admit. That night, the sound came again. It was later this time, well past midnight. I had just started dozing off when I heard the footsteps. Closer, slow, heavy crunches of something moving toward the cabin. Then they stopped, right outside the door. I lay still, holding my breath. My rifle was in the corner, unloaded. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. The doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, heart hammering in my chest. The knob turned slowly, back and forth, testing the lock. I lunged for my rifle, fumbling to load a round. My hands shook as I chambered around and aimed at the door. I didn't call out. I didn't say a word. Then silence. The doorknob stopped moving. The footsteps retreated, slow at first, then quicker, until they vanished into the night. I sat awake until dawn, rifle in hand, waiting for the sound to return. Didn't. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. The clearing was empty. The forest was still. But the door, there were scratches around the knob. Fresh ones. I packed my gear in less than 10 minutes. I didn't care how ridiculous it seemed. I wasn't staying another night. The hike back to my truck was the longest 3 miles I've ever walked. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me, but I never did. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and drove without looking back. I never returned to that cabin. My uncle offered it to me a few years later, said I could have it if I wanted. I told him no. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that something was watching me. Something tried to get inside, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. I don't know if I'll ever be the same after what happened at that cabin. When I close my eyes, I still see it. The woods pressing in, the thick scent of damp leaves and rotting wood, and the feeling that I was never truly alone. It started as a simple trip. I wanted some time away from the city, from work, from everything. I found the cabin online, a small place deep in the woods, miles from any town. The listing said it was secluded, peaceful, perfect for clearing the mind. That's what I needed. I packed my truck, filled the tank, and started driving. The first thing I noticed when I got close was how empty the road was. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and the GPS signal had dropped miles back. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches reaching over the road, blocking out most of the sunlight. The only sound was my tires crunching gravel. I tried not to think about how alone I was. The cabin itself was nothing special. A single-story structure, dark wood, a slanted metal roof, and a wraparound porch. It looked old but sturdy. There was a small clearing around it, but beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no neighbors. Just me and the woods. I went inside and did a quick check. The air was stale, but everything seemed fine. A basic kitchen, an old couch, a fireplace, a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed, and a bathroom with a rusty shower head. It wasn't fancy, but I wasn't expecting it to be. I spent the first day settling in, making sure everything worked. The power came from a generator behind the cabin, and the water came from a well. There was a small storage shed nearby filled with chopped wood and some old tools. A creek ran about 100 yards from the cabin, its soft gurgling the only sound apart from the occasional bird call. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I don't know why. The bed was fine and it was quiet. Too quiet. In the city, there's always noise. Cars, voices, sirens, something. Out here, there was nothing. It felt unnatural, like the world had been muted. Every small sound made me jump. The creak of the wooden walls, the rustling of leaves outside, the wind slipping through cracks in the cabin. I told myself I was being stupid. It was just a new place. It always takes time to adjust. But then I heard something else. Something real. Footsteps. Not mine. Not an animal. They were slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves just beyond the cabin. My stomach clenched. I sat up, listening. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again. Closer. I reached for the flashlight beside my bed. My heart hammered as I slid out from under the blanket and moved toward the window. I hesitated before looking outside, afraid of what I might see. Nothing. Just the trees, the darkness, the endless woods. I told myself it had to be an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Animals don't walk like that. The next morning, I found footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, trailing off into the woods. My chest tightened. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out there, walking around while I slept. Watching. I thought about leaving, but I told myself it was probably just some hiker. Maybe a hunter. I didn't want to overreact. Besides, I had a knife in the cabin, and I wasn't defenseless. I decided to stay. That was a mistake. That night, it happened again. I made sure everything was locked before I went to bed, but I barely slept. Every sound put me on edge. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't just outside. They were on the porch. I gripped the knife in my hand, my body frozen. The wooden planks groaned under the weight of something. Someone. Slow, steady steps moved toward the front door. I held my breath. A long silence. Then, the sound of the doorknob rattling. I nearly dropped the knife. My throat tightened. The door was locked. It had to be locked. Another silence. Then soft, dragging sounds as the steps moved away. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I searched for more tracks. They were there, clear as day. Someone had walked right up to my door. I checked the lock 3 times. It hadn't been tampered with, but the thought of someone trying to get inside made my skin crawl. I was done. I packed my bag and loaded it into the truck. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I was leaving. The truck didn't start. I sat there, turning the key, listening to the useless clicking sound. The battery wasn't dead. I had checked it before I left. It had been fine. Something wasn't right. I popped the hood, got out, and checked the engine. I didn't know much about cars, but it didn't take an expert to see the problem. Someone had cut the wires. My chest went ice cold. I turned and scanned the trees, my pulse pounding in my ears. Someone had done this while I slept. Someone was out there, watching. I grabbed my bag, my knife, and the flashlight. I wasn't staying. The nearest town was miles away, but I didn't care. I'd walk until I found help. I started down the dirt road, moving fast, glancing back every few steps. The forest was too quiet. Every rustling leaf made my skin crawl. I felt like I was being watched, hunted. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the trees, not moving, not speaking, just standing. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. At some point, I stumbled onto another road, a real road, paved one. Car appeared in the distance. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like a madman. The driver slammed the brakes, rolled down the window, and I practically collapsed against the car, gasping for breath. I don't remember what I told them, only that I needed to get out of there. They drove me to the nearest town where I called the cops. When they checked the cabin, they found the footprints. They found the cut wires, but they didn't find anyone. I never went back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know they're still out there, and I know they'll wait for the next person to come looking for peace and quiet. I pulled off the highway about an hour before dark, following the directions I had scribbled on a notepad. The road turned from smooth pavement to cracked asphalt and then to a narrow dirt trail winding through thick trees. My truck jolted over every rut and dip, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires the only noise for miles. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from the city and everything that came with it. I needed time away. Too much noise, too many people, and too much work had left me burnt out. A week alone in nature sounded like the perfect reset. The cabin came into view after another 10 minutes of slow driving. It was smaller than I expected, built from thick logs that had darkened over time. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in grime. It looked old but sturdy. I climbed out of the truck and stretched my legs, taking a deep breath of the cool forest air. It smelled like damp earth and pine, clean and crisp. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I grabbed my bags from the truck bed and walked up the short steps to the porch. The key had been left under a loose board near the door, just like the owner had said in their email. The lock turned with a heavy clunk, and I pushed the door open. The inside smelled like wood and dust. The furniture was simple, a worn-out couch, a small wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a stone fireplace in the corner. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. It wasn't much, but I wasn't here for comfort. I checked the kitchen first. A propane stove, a rusty sink, and a nearly empty fridge. There were a few old cans of food in the cabinets, but I had brought my own supplies. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress and a thick wool blanket. The bathroom was small, with a toilet and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in years. After unpacking, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip below the trees. The silence was heavier now, the woods growing darker with every passing minute. No streetlights, no distant hum of traffic, no people. Just the wind and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere out there in the trees. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't scared, but the loneliness felt different now, heavier. I shook it off, made a quick meal, and went to bed early. The mattress was stiff, and the cabin creaked with every gust of wind, but I was exhausted. I fell asleep fast. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay still, listening. The cabin was silent. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket higher. Just as I was about to drift off again, I heard it, a soft shuffle outside the window. My body tensed. Could have been anything. An animal, the wind, maybe just my imagination. I waited, barely breathing. The sound came again, this time closer. A slow, deliberate step on the porch. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. I hadn't charged it after the drive. Cursing under my breath, I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. The wooden floor was cold under my feet. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I stepped toward the window and peered outside. Nothing, just trees and shadows. The porch was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stayed up for a while, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The dirt in front of the porch was undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of anything or anyone. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge from being out here alone. I spent the day hiking, clearing my head. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the tall pines, the air fresh and crisp. I followed a trail down to a stream, filled my water bottle, and sat for a while, enjoying the peace. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already sinking. I made dinner, had another beer on the porch, and let the silence settle over me again. As darkness swallowed the trees, the uneasy feeling from the night before crept back in. I locked up and went to bed early again, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt louder. The wind against the roof, the distant hoot of an owl, my own breathing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, steady, moving just beyond the wall. I sat up, gripping the flashlight. The footsteps stopped. The cabin was completely silent. I waited, every muscle in my body tight. Then the sound of wood groaning under weight. The porch. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the window. I hesitated, then peeked through the curtain. In the darkness, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then something moved, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light. My stomach turned to ice. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, standing still, watching. I backed away, my mind racing. No car, no flashlight, no reason to be here. My truck was the only way in or out. Whoever this was, they had walked, or had been here all along. I grabbed the hunting knife from my bag and stood by the door, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I sat in the chair by the door, gripping the knife, and forced myself to stay awake. Sometime before dawn, I must have drifted off, because I jolted awake to the sound of birds outside. Morning light streamed through the window. I rushed outside. The figure was gone. But there, in the dirt by the porch, were fresh footprints. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just grabbed my keys, threw my bag into the truck, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road, watching me go. But there was nothing, just trees and empty road. I never looked back. I don't know if I was paranoid or if my gut was warning me. Maybe both. Either way, I knew something wasn't right the second I stepped onto that property. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. Just a simple getaway, something quiet, no cell service, no distractions. It was an old place, nothing fancy, but it had running water and electricity, and that was good enough for me. I needed time to clear my head. I parked my truck near the front porch, stepped out, and looked around. The air was still. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the trees. Just silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind either. It was the kind that made your ears strain for any sound at all. The cabin was small, A one-bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a living area. The walls were made of thick, aged logs, the kind that held years of history within them. The windows had old wooden shutters, and the front door was heavy with a single deadbolt. I carried my bag inside and shut the door behind me, locking it out of habit. The place smelled like damp wood and dust, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, giving off a dim, yellow light. I set my bag on the couch and looked around. The living room had a fireplace, a small coffee table, and an armchair that looked like it belonged to someone's grandfather. A doorway led to the kitchen, where an old gas stove and a tiny fridge sat against the wall. The bedroom was in the back, with a narrow hallway leading to a bathroom. Simple, just like I wanted. I spent the first hour getting settled, unpacking my things and checking the cabinets. A few mismatched dishes, some dusty silverware, and a single can of soup left behind by the last guest. I checked the fridge, empty except for a half-full bottle of water and a single beer. I left it alone. As the sun started to set, I stepped onto the porch with a beer of my own and looked out into the trees. The quiet still lingered, thick and unnatural. I told myself it was just my imagination. I was used to noise, cars, people, the hum of electricity. Out here, there was nothing. That's when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but it was too still, too human. My stomach tightened. It was hard to make out, just a dark shape standing between the trees. Watching, I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just shadows playing tricks. The mind does that when it's too quiet. I finished my beer, went inside, and locked the door. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the fireplace, read for a while, and eventually crawled into bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about that figure, the way it stood there, still and silent. At some point, exhaustion won. I slept. I woke up to a sound, a soft, scraping noise, like something brushing against wood. My heart pounded. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint orange glow in the living room. The sound came again. Scrape. I swallowed hard and reached for my flashlight. The cabin had no curtains, just open windows with wooden shutters. I slid out of bed, moving as quietly as I could, and stepped toward the living room. The front door was locked. The windows were shut, but something had been out there. I stood still, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon looking for food. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. Footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. My skin went cold. They led from the edge of the woods to the porch, then back again. Someone had been standing there, watching. I checked my truck, but it was untouched. I considered leaving, packing up and driving out. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I had come out here to get away, to clear my head. I wasn't going to let some footprints send me running. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped some firewood, made a small lunch, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling. But as the day went on, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see something. That night, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows. I kept the fire going longer than usual, sitting in the armchair, listening to the crackling wood. The quiet pressed in around me. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Scrape. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and stood. The noise was coming from the porch. I moved slowly, heart hammering, and stepped toward the window. I shined my light through the glass. Something moved, a shadow slipping back into the trees. I barely saw it, just a glimpse, a dark shape disappearing into the night. I locked every door, every window. I barely slept. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things, threw my bag into the truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. But when I turned the key, the engine just clicked. The battery was dead. My stomach sank. I had checked it yesterday. It was fine. I popped the hood, got out, and lifted it. The wires were cut. My hands went cold. Someone had done this. I grabbed my phone, knowing there was no service, but trying anyway. Nothing. I wasn't staying another night. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with essentials, and started walking. The nearest road was a few miles away. I walked fast, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps kept pace with mine, steady, unhurried. Then they stopped. I turned my head just slightly, just enough to see. A figure stood at the tree line, half hidden by the branches. Watching, I ran. I didn't stop until I hit the road. A truck passed by not long after, an older man behind the wheel. He saw my face, saw the fear, and didn't ask questions. He just opened the door and let me in. We drove straight to the nearest town. I never went back for my truck. I never went back for anything, and I never found out who or what was watching me. I was never the kind of person who got spooked easily. I'd spent nights alone in my house with the power out, walked through empty parking lots at night, and even slept in my car in the middle of nowhere more times than I could count. I always told myself that fear was something we made up in our heads. It wasn't real. It was just the mind playing tricks on itself. That changed the night I spent in that cabin. I had driven out to a small, isolated rental deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps, advertised on some obscure travel blog as a peaceful getaway for those needing a break from society. That sounded like exactly what I needed. Life had been too loud, too fast, too full of things that drained me. Work, people, responsibilities, I wanted none of it for a few days. Just quiet. The cabin was an old one, but well kept. It sat at the end of a dirt road that stretched on for miles, surrounded by thick trees that swallowed up the light before it could touch the ground. There were no neighbors, no cell service, just me, the trees, and the dark. When I arrived, I checked out the place. It was small, only one floor, with a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no TV, no radio, just a few old books on a shelf near the fireplace. Everything smelled like damp wood and dust. It wasn't fancy, but I didn't need it to be. After unloading my bags and setting up my space, I made a quick meal and sat outside on the porch as the sun began to set. The woods stretched on forever, thick and endless, swallowing the last bits of daylight. It was the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. No cars, no distant voices, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I didn't notice the unease at first. Came on slow, like a weight settling on my shoulders. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something in me knew that I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't hearing anything strange, wasn't seeing anything unusual, but I felt it. That prickling sensation in the back of my skull, like someone was standing just behind me. I shook it off. It was just my mind adjusting to the isolation. I was used to noise, to the constant hum of modern life. This was different. I told myself it was normal to feel a little strange. Night came fast, faster than I expected. One moment the sky was a deep blue, the next it was pitch black, the trees blending into an endless void. The only light came from the single lantern I had brought with me, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. I had planned on reading, maybe writing a little, but I couldn't focus. That feeling still hadn't gone away. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and tried to sleep. The first noise came sometime after midnight. A soft rustling, barely audible, just outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind. The wind moves in patterns, a steady rhythm through the trees. This was different, uncertain, slow, like footsteps moving through the brush. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. The woods were full of them. I rolled over, closed my eyes, and tried to ignore it. Then it happened again. This time it was closer, just outside the bedroom window. A crunch of dead leaves, a snap of a twig. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Someone was outside. Someone was standing right there, just beyond the thin wall of the cabin, listening, waiting. I reached for my phone before remembering. No service. No way to call for help. No way to even know how far I was from the nearest person. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, straining to hear something, anything, but the sound never came back. Eventually, exhaustion won. My body forced itself to sleep, even while my mind screamed at me to stay awake. I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. Not a knock, not the random noise of a branch swaying in the wind. A deliberate, steady tap, like fingertips brushing against the glass. I didn't move, didn't look, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, every muscle in my body locked in place. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't my imagination. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. If I didn't look, if I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would stop. Maybe whoever, whatever was out there would get bored and leave. Then I heard the door handle move. It wasn't loud, just a tiny, almost hesitant rattle. A test, seeing if it was locked. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I knew I had, but that didn't matter because someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a rusty old knife I had brought to cook with, and slipped out of bed as quietly as I could. The handle rattled again, harder this time. I crept toward the front door, every step slow, careful. The floor creaked under my weight. I stopped, holding my breath, listening for any reaction. Silence. I reached the door and pressed my back against the wall beside it, gripping the knife so tight my hand ached. My fingers brushed against the lock, checking it again. Still locked. Whoever was out there must have heard me moving because they stopped. The handle didn't move again. The tapping at the window didn't come back. The silence stretched on for so long I started to wonder if I had imagined it all. Then, from the other side of the door, barely above a whisper, I heard breathing. Long, slow, just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, knife in hand, waiting. Then the breathing stopped, and just like that, they were gone. I stayed awake until the sun came up, every muscle in my body locked in place, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When daylight finally bled through the trees, I forced myself to open the door. There were footprints in the dirt, human, barefoot, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I didn't stay to find out who or what had been there. I packed my things in record time, threw them into the car, and drove. Didn't stop, didn't look back. Not until I was miles away, back on the main road, surrounded by other cars, other people. I never found out who it was. I never told anyone, but I've never felt safe sleeping alone again. I never thought much about being alone in the woods. It always seemed peaceful, quiet, a break from everything. That's why I rented the cabin. A few days away from work, people, noise. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the river somewhere beyond the hills. It was an old place, but clean enough. The guy who rented it to me mentioned it had been in his family for years. His grandfather had built it way back, and now he just used it to make extra cash. It wasn't fancy. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a wood stove for heat. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just what I wanted. I brought a few books, some food, and my hunting rifle. Not because I planned to hunt, but because being alone in the woods with no way to call for help seemed like a good reason to have it. The first day was fine. I hiked a bit, read a little, cooked on the old gas stove. The air smelled fresh. The trees swayed gently in the wind. At night, the stars shone brighter than I'd ever seen. I sat on the porch, listened to the crickets, and let my mind empty. It was exactly what I needed, until I went to bed. The sound woke me up. At first, I thought it was an animal, a branch cracking somewhere outside. But then it happened again, closer. Footsteps, slow, steady. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. I held my breath, listened. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. The silence was worse. My heart pounded. I wanted to get up, look outside, but a voice in my head said, "Don't." I waited. 5 minutes, 10, maybe longer. Then I heard them again, moving away this time, fading into the trees. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe, something curious. But I wasn't convinced. I found tracks in the dirt outside, boot prints, not hooves or paws. I followed them a little way into the trees, but they just disappeared into the brush. I thought about leaving, but it seemed stupid to pack up over some footprints. It was probably just a hiker, someone who got turned around and didn't want to bother me. I told myself that and tried to enjoy the day, but I felt different now, on edge. I didn't wander far. Every noise made me look over my shoulder. That night, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle just in case. I kept my rifle next to me in bed. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Then the footsteps came again. This time, they stopped right outside the door. I sat up, gripping the rifle, holding my breath. The handle rattled softly at first, then harder. I wanted to shout, to ask who was there, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent, barely breathing. The rattling stopped, then a soft knock, just once, then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains. The chair was still against the door. Nothing had changed, but when I stepped outside, I saw them. More footprints, more than one set this time, leading from the woods to my door. And right there in the dirt, a small knife. A hunting knife, old and rusted, but sharp enough. I packed my things, fast, tossed everything into my truck, and didn't even stop to check if I'd forgotten something. I didn't care. I drove down that dirt road like something was chasing me. Like if I stopped, whoever had been outside my cabin might finally step into the open. I didn't call the owner. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? I still think about it sometimes, especially at night. Who was out there? What did they want? And what would have happened if I had opened the door? I don't know why I thought renting the cabin was a good idea. Maybe I wanted some time alone. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Either way, I booked it, drove out there, and by the time I realized I'd made a mistake, it was too late. The cabin sat deep in the woods, past miles of narrow, twisting dirt roads. The listing had made it sound peaceful, secluded, perfect for a quiet getaway. I wanted the quiet. I thought I needed it. The first red flag should have been the drive-in. I had to slow to a crawl to avoid potholes and branches stretching across the path. The trees felt like they were closing in, the sky narrowing between them. No cell service. That was expected, but still unsettling. If something happened out here, I was on my own. The second red flag was the state of the cabin. The pictures had shown a quaint, well-kept little place with a porch and a fire pit out front. In reality, the wood was cracked and faded, the windows smudged, the porch slanted just enough to notice. The door creaked when I opened it. The air inside stale and cold. Smelled wrong. Not rotten, not exactly moldy, just off. Like something old that had been shut up for too long. Figured I could air it out. I went inside, set down my bag, and tried to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. The layout was simple. A living area with an old couch and a wood stove. A tiny kitchen with a fridge that hummed too loud. A short hall leading to a bedroom and a small bathroom. No TV, no internet, no distractions. That was the point, wasn't it? To be alone, away from everything. I should have left that first night. I made a fire in the stove, heated up some canned soup, and tried to settle in. The silence pressed against my ears. Every little creak of the cabin sounded too loud. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees. I reminded myself that it was just wind, just an old cabin settling. I repeated that a lot over the next few days. The first night was restless. I woke up at some point, heart pounding for no reason. The room was too dark. The kind of dark that makes you feel blind, like the walls are closing in. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black, dead. That didn't make sense. I charged it before I left. I felt my way to the nightstand, grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on. The bedroom door was open. I was sure I had closed it. I always closed doors out of habit. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse hammering in my ears. Maybe I had left it open. Maybe the wind had shifted the old wood. I closed it again, locked it this time, and lay awake until morning. The next day, I walked around outside, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The trees were dense, tangled. The air smelled damp, like rain was coming. I noticed something strange about the ground. Little holes like something had been digging. Not animal tracks, just holes. I told myself it was nothing, maybe squirrels or raccoons, but they looked deliberate, spaced out in a way that made no sense. That night, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, kept my flashlight next to me. I fell asleep eventually, but it didn't last long. Something woke me, a noise, faint but sharp, a scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I froze, straining to hear. It stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Then another sound, not scraping this time. Tap, light, deliberate, coming from the front door. I didn't move. My body refused. The tapping came again, 3 slow, steady knocks. I sat up, heart hammering. It was the middle of the night. No one should be out here. I grabbed my flashlight, forced myself to stand. The floor felt too cold under my feet. I stepped into the living area, keeping my back to the wall. The doorknob moved, turned slightly, like someone was testing it. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard a car, no footsteps, nothing. Just the tapping, just the slow twist of the knob. I backed away, moving toward the kitchen, toward the back door. I didn't want to turn my light on. I didn't want whoever, whatever, was out there to know exactly where I was. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle. A noise from the window stopped me. Not a knock, not a tap, a breath, slow, shallow, right outside the glass. I ran. I didn't think. I just yanked the door open and ran. The cold air hit me, the night swallowing me whole. I ran toward my car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. My hands were shaking too hard. I dropped them. I cursed, dropped to my knees, clawing at the ground. Another noise, closer this time. Not footsteps, something else. A shift in the air, presence. I found the keys, scrambled up, got into the car, locked the doors. My breath came in gasps, fogging up the windshield. I shoved the key into the ignition, twisted it. The engine sputtered. No. I twisted it again. Nothing. Something moved in the trees ahead, just past the reach of my headlights. I couldn't see it, not really, just the outline. Tall, still, watching. I turned the key again, begging, praying. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, backed out so fast I nearly went off the road. My tires spun, dirt kicking up behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just drove, faster than I should have, down that twisting, broken road, away from whatever had been standing there. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I parked under the bright lights, locked the doors, and tried to stop shaking. I never went back for my things. I called the rental company, told them I was leaving early. Didn't explain why. A few weeks later, curiosity got the best of me. I looked up the cabin, tried to find anything about it. It wasn't listed anymore. The owner had taken it down. No explanation, like it had never existed. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear it. The tapping.